So you find farmers involved in many different activities and not just farming, and they'll try and ride patterns to ensure that even if the rains do fail, they'll still get some harvest from one of their crops. Exposed if the rainfall is actually realized when farmers engage in costly cooking strategies, for example, seeking off-farm employment, selling livestock and non-farm assets, and at the exchange they might withdraw children from schools and energy help the parents in their households. So do households need insurance? So we imagine that insurance would be valuable to households if they have no lesser needs of coping with risk. And it does seem that at least in developing countries, risk-sharing mechanisms are inadequate, particularly against providers where everyone in the village is affected by this risk. So some studies that show this are Machini and Yang find that local rainfall variation around the time of birth affects schooling, health, and socioeconomic status. Dufour and Udry find that there isn't perfect risk sharing even within households. And there's also evidence that rainfall shocks generate exogenous variation in income that can lead to poverty traps. So households often engage in costly income smoothing in response to rainfall. So we imagine that insurance would be a valuable tool that farmers could use to mitigate against risk, against rainfall risk in particular. But in sub-Saharan Africa and in many parts of the world, traditional crop insurance has had limited success. This is right. So and the main problem with this is that it's very hard, or it's very expensive for farms to verify whether farmers have actually undergone loss. So index-based weather insurance could be a great solution to this problem, since how index-based insurance works is that a farmer will insure a crop based on a proxy, which in our case is rainfall, which causes yield loss. So the insurance company will look at the record of rainfall in a certain area for a long period of time, and based on this record, they'll be able to price an insurance product. And the insurance will pay the farmer as long as the expected rainfall doesn't occur. So the Meteorological Society says that there was the rainfall was inadequate, then the insurance company will pay. The benefits of index insurance is that it eliminates moral hazard, since there's nothing that a farmer can do to affect the rainfall in a certain area. There are no transaction costs. The company doesn't have to go and actually verify that there was a loss. All they need to do is see what the Meteorological Society in the country says. If they say that it rained below a certain amount, then they'll pay out. Then there should be fast settlement of claims, since payments aren't subjective. All the company needs is information about whether the rainfall was inadequate or not. However, voluntary uptake of index insurance has been limited. So index insurance contracts have been tried in many parts of the world, but take-up has been really low. So the goal of this study was to try and look at one method of maybe stimulating demand for index insurance by looking at financial literacy and seeing how this affects the understanding of the product and then leads, and whether it leads to greater take-up of insurance, and then also to better understand the benefits of information dissemination among farmers. So some preliminary results are that we find that social networks play an important role on farmers' decision to purchase drought insurance. So receiving financial literacy materials, where many of the farmers' neighbors similarly receive financial literacy materials, increases the likelihood that a farmer will purchase insurance by 4.3%. Whereas receiving financial literacy materials where very few other farmers receive them actually decreases the likelihood that a farmer will purchase insurance, so this is significant. And in contrast, we find strong individual effects for discount vouchers on farmers' decision to purchase insurance, or we find no social network effects. So I should have had a slide in the middle, of just giving you a roadmap of where I'm going, but right now I'm just going to give a bit more motivation about the study. I'll tell you about the experiment that we used to study this, and then present the results then. So Index insurance is a really difficult product to explain, and there's evidence that the complexity of index insurance has deterred demand for index insurance in Malawi. So in this study, we're going to be testing a comic that describes index insurance, why it's important in a very simple, we hope simple and accessible format. And this is also a cheap way of providing information that should be easily scalable. Looking at social network effects, Chile et al. Reported there's a correlation between participation in insurance markets and membership in village networks. And in this study, we are trying to assess the degree to which information disseminates and the role this has on the demand for the insurance product. So the design of the study, this was carried out with farmers in eastern Kenya. At the baseline, we enumerated all the coffee grain households within our study area. And following the census, we grouped households into clusters based on geographic proximity. And then the clusters were randomized into either high or low provision of comics or vouchers. So specifically, if a household was in a high intensity cluster, they had a 3 in 5 chance of drawing a 50% voucher, a 1% chance of drawing a 25% voucher, and a 1 in 5 chance of drawing a 0 voucher off the price of insurance. Similarly, for the comic clusters, households in a high comic cluster had a 3 in 5 chance of drawing or being given a comic, and households in a low intensity cluster had only a 1 in 5 chance. So this is just a map showing what the clusters look like. So all the points are GPS markers for where our different households were. Then around each household, a radius of 60 meters was drawn, and we made a circle, and all the circles that were overlapping formed one cluster. So for instance, this is one cluster. And all the households that were far away from the nearest cluster were just joined to the nearest one. From the nearest circle were joined to the nearest cluster. Okay, so out of our full sample, we were able to form 189 clusters, and as I mentioned before, we were randomized into one of the 6 groups here, where there are no comics, low intensity comics, and high intensity comics, orthogonal to having a high intensity voucher cluster or a low intensity voucher cluster. Okay, so I just wanted to show you the comic that we used to describe index insurance to households. So these are just a few panels. It was about 16 pages long. So, in the comic, so we describe how index insurance works in the field. Rainfall is measured throughout the season, and each phase has its own water requirements. And the payout amount depends on the water that's actually received during the different phases of growth. And then the comic also tried to answer some of the questions that we realized that farmers had about index insurance. So for instance, if rainfall is normal, will we get our premium back? And premium kind of being given back. So this is how the discount coupons look like. So depending on what the farmer drew in the field, if they draw 50% discount coupon, this is what they're given, and they will go then with the purchasing insurance and redeem it off the price of insurance. Okay, so when we were implementing the study, we had a few problems in that from our baseline study, between the baseline and the time we actually had to implement the insurance study, we had a very short time, and we weren't able to find some of the households in our original study to either do a baseline with them or to do the intervention. But then we don't think that this is correlated with the study in any way, since since the households just couldn't be found, there was no reason other than maybe the short time that we had to do the study. But this is something that happened. So from the baseline, what our study population looks like, it was almost 80% male-headed households. The average age of the household head was 55 with 5 years of education. And more importantly, so most of the farmers here agree that drought is the most important risk that we face in farming. So this is comparing the different kinds voucher, no comment, no voucher, and so forth. And I guess the takeaway from this slide is just that the randomization in the field worked for the most part. Okay, so this is looking at comparing the households that actually received comments with those that didn't. And I guess the takeaway from this slide is that there are no significant differences between the households that received comments and those that didn't. Okay, this also compares households that received 50% vouchers, 25% vouchers, and 0 vouchers. And again, there are no significant differences between these households. Okay, so this is looking at the results. So here we're looking at the dependent variable is whether a farmer actually wants insurance, and we're running it against whether the household was assigned into one of these groups. So receiving a comment in a high comment cluster, comment in low comment cluster, and so forth. And so we see that receiving a comment in a high comment cluster increases the probability that a farmer will purchase insurance by 4.3%, off a mean of 1.6% among the controls. Receiving a 50% voucher in a high voucher intensity cluster increases purchase, but similarly, receiving a 50% voucher in a low voucher intensity cluster increases the likelihood that a farmer will purchase insurance. But these aren't statistically significantly different from each other. So we also look at a different definition of the social network other than the cluster. So just looking at farmers within a certain geographical distance from the individual farmer. And we look at different bands. So 0 to 150 meters away, 200 and 300. And so here what we see is for a farmer individually receiving a comic has no statistically significant effect on their decision to purchase insurance themselves, even though the point estimates are negative. Having an additional comic, different number of meters away reduces the likelihood that they'll purchase insurance. So it's only significant 150 meters away. But more importantly, receiving a comic when another farmer around you receives another comic increases the likelihood of purchase by 4.7%. And though the effect attenuates, it's still positive and significant. And this we interpret as a reinforcement effect. So when I receive a comic, having another farmer within my network or within close proximity to me who also receives a comic allows us to talk and kind of reinforces the message that I received. And so interestingly, we find again that the voucher here has a very strong positive effect on a farmer's individual likelihood of purchasing insurance, but there are no social network effects. So the more farmers around me who receive these discounts to purchase insurance, this has no effect on a farmer's own likelihood of purchasing insurance. So about 7 months after the study after the baseline and the studies were completed, we did a follow-up via phone with the farmers in our study. And in that time, there had been a drought and the insurance actually paid out to the people who purchased insurance. So the follow-up was done by phone, and so we have fairly low response rates, but it looks like we were able to get the same numbers of people in the different clusters, even though receiving a 50% voucher increases the likelihood that the person was available for the follow-up, but only slightly. Okay, so one of the mechanisms we think was happening for the reason why we see these social network effects for the provision of the comic is that perhaps farmers were able to talk to each other and help each other understand this product, which we know is difficult. But so we don't see, so here the dependent variable is understanding of index insurance, and it's a set of questions that we ask both at the baseline and at the follow-up, and we want to see whether their understanding of insurance changed. And if anything, for the provision of comics, we don't find that there are any changes in the understanding of insurance. If anything, we find for someone who received a comic when very few other farmers in their area received comics, their understanding of insurance is actually less. And there's a similar story when we look at the distance bands that there don't seem to be any changes in the understanding of it.
How exactly do you measure that?
The understanding of insurance. So it was a set of questions where we gave a scenario showing, so if you bought this contract for index insurance and the contract was for 200 millimeters, would you be paid if it rained 250? Would you be paid if it rained 150? And how much would you be paid? So these are things that were described in the comic, so they should be able to understand. But it was just very simple questions about just giving a basic understanding. And then these are just normalized.
Is that the variable we find as cognitive skills? Is a variable?
No, so this is a score on how they did on these understanding of insurance questions.
So how do you measure the cognitive skills? There's a variable in one of your tables.
Right. So for the cognitive skills we did Raven tests. So I'm actually not sure if I included them here, but I did a specification where I did include Raven scores as a control and didn't change the results very much. So I guess the takeaway here is that the provision of comics didn't substantially change the people's understanding of insurance. If anything, there was this negative effect for people who received these materials and maybe didn't have a social network to receive these materials who they could chat with about this. But where there are these social network effects, where the comic is in people's attitudes towards insurance. So both at the baseline and in the follow-up, they asked, does insurance protect you in times of emergency? Do insurance companies try to cheat people when they have a big claim? And I don't need insurance because my family or friends provide cover when necessary. And so what we find are people who received comics in high comic clusters are more likely to believe that insurance protects in times of emergency, are less likely to think that insurance companies would cheat them. And these effects diffuse even if the person didn't receive a comic themselves. So we see kind of the same magnitude of effects for people in high comic clusters. But in terms of seeing the need for insurance, this only works for people who received a voucher to purchase insurance. So in conclusion, what we do with the study is to use a randomized experiment to compare the effect of financial literacy materials and discount vouchers in influencing farmers' decision to purchase index insurance. And we find that social networks reinforce messages provided in financial literacy materials, but discount vouchers don't.
Thank you very much, Ms. Can we leave that for questions? So, Azim, please. We have Azim Rahim discussing the
So you conduct the experiment, which consists of two types of interventions. First of all, you give comic books to clusters of households on insurance, explaining how these insurances work, or you give them discount vouchers on the purchase of insurance. Now, some households fall into the high comic clusters where the majority, a large substantial portion of the household get these comics, and some households will fall in the high voucher clusters. And so your results, if I could summarize the first part of the result, is that if you're a lucky farmer, if you end up with a comic in the high comic cluster, you have a higher take-up rate than a farmer who also has a comic, but who is in a cluster where a household do not have low probabilities of getting comics. The second result is that a lucky farmer who lives nearby a cluster where the intensity of comic distribution is high, also has a higher take-up than a farmer who lives far away from that cluster. And the third result is that a farmer who also ends up with a voucher, a discount voucher, who lives in a high voucher cluster, does not have significantly higher take-up rates than a farmer who lives in a low voucher cluster. So these three results basically sum up to the following, that there is some evidence that there are network effects in learning about insurance. So if you live in a cluster where people have high probability of getting the comic books, you learn from them and therefore you have higher probabilities of taking up the insurance. Secondly, you also have some network effects that spills over from one cluster to the other. And thirdly, I won't say it here, but there doesn't seem to be any network effect on vouchers. So much of the network effects seems to be happening in learning. Now, some of my comments really relate to the intuition, which I found, perhaps quickly could spend more time on this intuition. So you have an interesting intuition for the reasons why there's a high take-up in high comic clusters. That's because the insurance contract is complex, and therefore, if you live in clusters where comics are widespread, you learn from this. The question that I have is, why is it that there is no such network effects in clusters with high discount vouchers, especially when the financial incentive seems to be very high? You have a 50% discount if you end up with a voucher. Surely, I would think that by purchasing more insurance, farmers would learn as much as reading a comic. But they won't learn instantly, but perhaps they would learn when a wave insurance pays off, and it did in the next 8 months. So my question is, could it be that what you're capturing here are network effects that only occur in the initial adoption phase? So at the point of adoption, there is a network effect in learning, but once the insurance is adopted, there could be a network effect afterwards related to the fact that lots of people use this insurance in your network, therefore you learn also from that. And so you could actually, that result could actually be an initial network effect, and perhaps there's something that you haven't captured. Now, if I would talk a bit now about do your follow-up results. So it seems from your objectives in doing the follow-up, you have farmers there are 3 reasons why there's a low take-up of insurance. Firstly, farmers are not financially conversant with the material. Secondly, they do not trust the financial institutions. Or thirdly, they think they don't know. And what you have found is that farmers who have a comic or who do not have a comic in high comic clusters show improved levels of trust. What I think is an interesting result, and I would perhaps you could spend more time talking about it, and it's there in your paper, is that farmers who live in high voucher clusters find that it actually needs insurance. So there is this result that that farmers in high voucher clusters also learn somehow. Okay, I'll skip the intuition. Now, what I would like to see more as an extension to the paper is to talk about the impact of the covariance that you have on the purchase of insurance. How important is the risk aversion of the farmer? What is the importance of that? What is the impact of the understanding of insurance, initial level understanding before receiving a comic? How does that interact perhaps with receiving a comic? Level of wealth of the farmer, because there's some evidence that wealthier farmers tend to adopt insurance, so perhaps that could be something you could explore. Additionally, when it comes to the relationships that your cluster members have, I don't know if you have information about the relationship they have, whether they are families or friends, And that could be something to say about the transmission of the network effects. And thirdly, I would like to see also whether there is an interaction between comics and vouchers, whether in high comic and high cluster, high voucher clusters, the learning is higher or is the same also. But overall, I think it's a very interesting, you have some very clear-cut results, which I think are very interesting.
Thank you very much. So let's open for questions. So we do have a question.
I'd like to look at the last reversion slide in standard level, because I find it very interesting that the no comic in high class treatment seem to have a more intense effect than comic in high comic for both coefficients. And what the difference is?
So this one?
Yes, I can see that the knowledge that comes from listening to your peers is more important than listening to peers plus actually the comic.
Right, so I don't know if these are, I should check. I don't think these are statistically significantly different from each other, but I can check and be sure. Yeah, so that's something that I should check. I don't think that they're significantly different from each other.
Universal prime.
Yeah.
Also,
Yeah.
thank you.
More questions?
Okay. About the attrition rate, you said 17%. Is that for treatment and control groups?
I'm sorry.
It's for unconditional sample?
The attrition at the beginning?
Yeah, the 17% attrition.
Right, so it was before we actually gave out the intervention, so it was, I guess, also from the initial samples that we had. So we hadn't given out the comics or and the vouchers people actually had to pick from a hat, so that hadn't happened.
And afterwards you had no attrition?
So we had some attrition in the follow-up, because we did the follow-up by phone, and we're only able to reach, I think it's about 60% of our study population. But then that doesn't look like it was very strongly correlated with our treatments, except that people who received 50% vouchers were slightly more likely to be available for the follow-up, but in magnitude it's not very high.
Do you try non-parametric ones to see what happens?
No, so I need to try that.
Okay.
So if I understood you correctly, you have a result saying that in the low comic area, the people that received the comics were less they had less insurance understanding. Or was that correct?
So the people...
That there was a negative effect from being in the low comic. One of your interactions, you had a negative effect on the low comic on understanding index insurance.
Right, yeah. So we have this negative effect for, so I guess here this would be someone who received a comic without, just the effect of receiving a comic when nobody else around you receives a comic. So we're interpreting this, right. So yeah, so I'm still not very sure what to make of this. It only appears, from 200 meters away, but it could be that since the farmer isn't able to, speak with other people about the index insurance and they aren't able to, then maybe their understanding of it is less, or maybe they get some wrong understanding of the product. So I'm still not sure. We're still trying to think about what to make of that.
So you want to respond to any other comments?
Is there any other
So no other questions? Okay. Thank you very much. Okay, so right now, as you have about thickness, other thickness like
Okay, so this paper is Nova. This paper is joined with José Tavares. And so we really want to understand what is the mechanism of transmission of attitudes, in that particular case of gender attitudes, from one generation to the other. Especially, I mean, in that particular case from mothers to sons and daughters. Let me give you a little motivation, perhaps, of why attitudes matter. Well, there are several studies that show that there is a high output cost of low female participation. I'll just cite one from my co-author, which shows that low female labor participation resulting from a gap between male and female wages could account for the whole of GDP gap with the US to some countries. So in the case of countries that have high levels of capital or natural resources, but have high levels of discrimination, perhaps, for example, Saudi Arabia, would have, if they were to converge to male-female wage rates in the US, would have very similar levels of GDP. Okay. Well, obviously, it's not that easy to just ordain US levels of male to female wage rates. There are several barriers, institutional and perhaps more importantly, cultural barriers that prevent this from happening. And let me motivate why we think there is a big strand now in the literature which thinks that perhaps cultural barrier is the most important. Let me introduce you to a puzzling fact, which is the following. Gender gaps in education, as a matter of fact, both in, especially in high-income countries, but also in low-income countries, are basically closed. In fact, if you look at this figure here, in high-income countries there are more female college graduates than male. This has been going on for some time. And the gap is also narrowing in low-income countries. But surprisingly, the female labor force participation gap, the gap between male labor force participation and female, is not closing. And in some countries, even in high-income countries, the female participation could be as low as half male participation. Well, to come back to the gender gap, let me just show you very quickly another figure. Looking at the world regions, we could see that this phenomenon is not just limited to advanced economies, it's happening in all around the world. So we looked at the fraction of men and women who completed college education, the increase in that fraction in all parts of the world, except for sub-Saharan Africa. The gap is positive for women as well. But if we look at, and that's data from 2010, if we look at female labor participation, we can see quite a substantial diversity across countries. If you look at the x-axis measure is the score of the educational attainment of a country when it comes to gender inequality. So an educational attainment of 1 means that there is perfect equality in enrollment of boys and girls in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. So, and you could see that many countries are very close to 1. Some of them are even above 1. But they still have, look at the x-axis, they still have quite different levels of female labor participation. The other thing I would like to draw your attention to is that, and I've highlighted some sub-Saharan African countries, is that there is some substantial diversity among them. Some countries have low levels of educational attainment, some high, and also when it comes to female labor participation. Okay, now the question is if educational attainment is not driving female labor participation, could it be that it's being mediated by some cultural factors? So could it be that culture is playing something? And we now have some data set that have been looking at attitudes towards gender roles and so on. And I've just picked the World Value Survey, one attitudinal question, just to illustrate very briefly. So the question that I asked to the people here are whether job priority should be for men. So if you have a high value for that, it means that you have some kind of preference for discrimination. And you could see the lowest here, the lowest preference for discrimination is in the OECD, and perhaps the highest. So as many as 75% of men, or even 60% of women think that jobs, in the Middle East and Northern Africa, think that jobs should be given to men. Now, firstly, if we look at Sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't do too badly compared to many other regions. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if I look at individual countries, there is substantial diversity as well. So from Ethiopia, only very few men and women think a job should be for men. Low preference for discrimination, but in Mali, for example, it's very different. The third thing I would like to point out is that if we go back, so these differences in preferences here for discrimination, if we look very closely at what happens when it comes to female labor participation, we could see that it's actually more related, attitudes are more related to female labor participation than education is. So look at Ethiopia, for example, have a low gap, have a low educational attainment of women. The gap is still is big, and it has high levels of female participation. Many countries that actually are above, where women, there are more women in the workforce than men in Mozambique. Next question. The next question is whether which drives which. So does attitude affect female labor participation, or female labor participation affect attitudes? So recently there is this trend.
So does your measurement criteria take into consideration the informal labor market?
It's on the ILO. I don't think so.
Because many women are
Perhaps it does. I have to check it. Data from the ILO. Yeah. Somebody has already asked me this question. That's it. Okay, so the kind of interest now when we look at the importance of culture on economics is to see whether attitudes can change. And so if we look at, and attitudes do change. So this is data from the US, and it's quite a substantial, large, big series here. And you see that there has been quite a big shift in attitudes towards working wives in the US. In 1935, and I would remind you that in 1935, the per capita income of the US was still 6-7 times more than the per capita income of Sub-Saharan Africa is now, or even more. But still, the attitudes were very, very traditional. Only 20% of Americans approved the working wives. And there has been quite a substantial change to now. Now, what could drive changes in attitudes? Well, several explanations have been provided. One could be economic development that pushed women into the labor force, that changed the wage rate, makes it more attractive to go to the labor force. But it could also be historical factors, accidents. So this here, 1945, is what we can see a big push, a big change in attitudes towards less traditional values. And that's because of male enrollment in the Second World War. Women were pushed by accident into the labor force and so on. And there are other episodes that people have also studied related to medical improvements in childbearing, medical improvements and so on. So all this would have an impact on attitudes. So if attitudes change slowly, even if it changes slowly, does it affect female labor participation? And more importantly, at least in that context, how does it change? And so what we want to look at is cultural transmission. How does it change, or how does it persist from one generation to the other? So the seminal paper in the literature is that by Fernandez, who looks at whether having a working mother, so previous generation being in the labor market, increases the probability of their son marrying a working woman. And they found a significant impact on that. So the result is that from one generation to the other, the fact that the previous generation worked implies that the next generation also works, and it creates this virtuous cycle. The question that has not been studied, and we want to study here, is what does the mother actually transmit? Does she actually transmit her attitudes, or does she actually transmit her work status? If she works, but she has traditional attitudes, what happens? So in fact, if we look at data generally on attitudes and work, we see there are some mothers that have dissonant work status and attitudes. Some mothers who may work but have traditional attitudes, or some others who may not work but have non-traditional attitudes. And how does that transmit to the children? So in that literature, the major pitfall is really the question of heterogeneity, which is literature transmission really has this big problem, which is the reflection problem. If we see correlation between mother and son or daughters, could it be really parental influence, or could it be some direct social influence? So if they both live in the same environment, they have the same social address, it could be that they are both influenced by the same factors and we're not capturing that. It's an observable. There are theoretical papers that show that some form of observationally equivalent situations. So the successful approaches in the literature has been to either to do an epidemiological approach or to look at data on free generation. So what are epidemiological approaches? It's to look at individuals who are faced with similar constraints but who have different upbringings. So to be more precise, Fernandez and Fogli look at second-generation Americans. So they grew up in the same environment in America with the same constraints, but they have different upbringings because they are second-generation Americans, so they have parents that were immigrants. And they find that, well, the fertility and works, the culture from which the person comes from has an impact. So culture matters, and it affects female labor participation, among others, it affects fertility and things. The second approach is to look at data on 3 generations, and this has been explored by a few people. I'm just mentioning one here. So really is to use the first generation as an instrument, the grandparents as instrument to identify the parental influence. Okay, so we're gonna use this approach, and here we're gonna have to use a data set that's the National National Survey of Youth, because it's the only data set that we are aware of that actually contains information on 3 generations, work status, attitudes, and so on 3 generations, so it's been going on for some time. And the relevant data that we're going to look at are attitudes of mothers on gender roles, when the child was growing up. We also have a work status when the child was growing up. We also have a spectrum of characteristics, but we also have the grandparents' characteristics, work status of grandparents, and so on. But we also have the attitudes of the children when they are teenagers and when they are a bit older. So let me show you very quickly some summary statistics. So if we look at, if we decompose male and female, we could see the variable attitude here. This is just one of the many attitudinal variables that is contained in a data set. But is the opinion of the individual on the traditional husband-wife role? Well, it's the best one. I think the formulation is longer, but I'll just summarize it to that. So basically, a value of 1 would be that the person disagrees with that, so the person has no traditional values. And it's clear that female would have higher values of 1 than men because they have lower preferences for discrimination. When it comes to the mothers, we could see that there's not much difference, so male and females have very similar, mothers have very similar opinions. And similarly, when we look at the labor force participation, a very high typical case of the mothers when the child was between 2 and 9, very not substantially different from boys and girls. We also see, and perhaps motivate why we want to identify the channel, that there are mothers really, in that data set at least, that have dissonant values, dissonant working status from their views, and that's quite substantial. We have a whole bunch of controls that in 5 minutes I won't be able to talk about. Basically, we control for lots of things, including the peer pressure that the teenager faces. Could be a factor that could influence his or her attitudes, and so lots of things. The basic identification strategy is to model. So we have attitudes of the child or the young adult as a function of the mother's attitude and the work status, plus a bunch of controls. But the attitudes of the mother and the work status are endogenous, and it depends on some instruments, Z1 and Z2. And we choose, what instrument do we choose? We choose the grandparents' socioeconomic status and their education. So the assumption is that once we control for lots of things in the mothers and the young adults' characteristics, whatever is unmeasured and is transferred from one generation to the other doesn't survive 2 generations. Grandparents only affect the young adult through the parents. Okay. What we find is that, well, first of all, having non-traditional attitudes doesn't matter. If a mother doesn't participate in the labor force, whether the what did I say? Yeah. So having these are the marginal effects. Having non-traditional attitude moving from 0 to 1, the mother's attitudes, whether she has traditional or not, doesn't have any impact on the attitudes of the child, whether it's a boy or a girl. So attitudes on its own doesn't matter. Whether the mother was working or not, this has no impact. However, the work status of the mother, when she was working, when the child was growing up, has an impact, but it only impacts on the attitudes of the next generation, boys and girls, when she also has non-traditional attitudes. So here we really need the conjunction of the two. We really need mothers to work, but also to have non-traditional attitudes. And this is basically what we are trying to show. And actually, in the social psychology literature, there's a lot of discussion on that. That is what they call observational learning. And observational learning only works well when it's reinforced by some kind of verbal exhortation by the parents. And so this confirms what we say. So we do also some tests, and in my 1 minute I will go through them, but they're okay. We also look at whether this influence changes persists over time, and we find that it is true, at least for daughters. So even when the daughter is in her 30s, 22 to 30, in her 20s rather, she still keeps that attitude that she inherits from her mom. And also do some tests. And I'm going to conclude. So what we find is that what the mother does matters, but only when she thinks along the same lines. And we find that this effect is persistent, and this effect is different by gender, at least over time. After initially there is still an impact, there is both an impact on the boys and the girls, but eventually the effect persists only on the daughters. So I hope I have
Perfect. So, thank you very much. Description, just a summary of the paper. So basically, actual work status of mothers is found to be more important than attitudes of mothers in determining children's attitudes on gender. So that's the main statement of the paper. Then also they find that this is particularly the case for inquiring households, and So the strategy that they use for identification is to use an ID, employing grandparents' education and occupation as an education. So basically the assumption here, the exclusion restriction specifically is that grandparents do not have direct influence on these children's attitudes. So that's the sense in which it's very important that they use three genetics. Okay, so I just have not so many comments, so let me just, so something that really is in the paper, but probably wasn't brought so much to the presentation. So the claim that causality problems are dealt with by using the opinion of the mother when the child was very young, okay, so was under the age of 10. But this does not do with taking into account the possibility that the gender of the child influences the attitudes. And I also learned that that's quite prominent in the literature. So, so to a certain extent, I would still be very cautious in saying that these deals with causality. So then, the exclusion restriction, of course, I mean, probably not many restrictions are still proof, but probably, well, this is also not still proof, I'm sure you agree. But I think you can do a little bit more with respect to this. So, and this is just a suggestion, probably for some robustness. So maybe you could focus on children of old mothers. So you certainly have that data on the age of these women. And of course that would minimize interaction with grandparents. So we would be more sure that would really be followed, the assumption of no direct interaction with grandparents. So, but even if you would go further and really try to use, if you have the age of death of the grandparents, if available. So then, small points. So then, you have some interesting results, and probably my questions are about the whys. I'm not sure if they are easily dealt, probably not. But why is the main result only valid for two-parent households? So that wasn't so clear. Maybe it's relatively obvious, but it's just because no variation for one-parent households on work status. Maybe that's the answer. But that wasn't clear from reading. Then why is the effect only persisting for daughters? That wasn't also so clear. So what's the interpretation that we may have out of it? And of course, for interpretations, we usually need data, and maybe it's not available. But maybe some theory could help you. Add some details. So results probably should be shown for the probe with separating, for the simple probe, because you show first, you haven't here, but you show first the simple probe with separating between two-parent and single-parent households, which is something really prominent for the main results. And for robustness, also changing one variable at a time, because it changed all of them altogether, could also add a little bit to the measure. So this is what I had. So let's open for questions.
Sorry, just go back to your main results. I was just wondering whether there's just symmetry in the bottom row in each of those two panels.
No,
Maybe
it's
it's this one. So you're looking at if mother works, so in panel A you're saying mother works the effects on the effect of change in your animal's conditional owner work should be the same thing as conditional owner having attitudes, the effect of the change in the work. The bottom row and the top panel, shouldn't those effects be the same as the bottom row?
No, I mean, we're looking at the marginal effect conditional on the.
Are they only different because you have different sources of variation?
Yes.
have like
Yes, yes, yes.
an experiment with the idea.
Yeah.
So you might want to just think about testing to see whether you can reject the same.
Yeah, you say that these, yeah, but this is a change from the most effective change in one of the,
Yeah.
so it's a different variation.
But I'm just saying that you have to be supportive to test to see whether the bottom row and the top panel equals the bottom row and the bottom.
I didn't get that one.
So in the top panel, it's telling us if you go from not having attitude 0 to having attitude 1, if she's already working, you get some effect at something like 0.2.
Yeah.
And in the bottom panel, it's saying if conditions, maybe it's on the bottom row, but the bottom panel there's conditional upon her having attitude with 1, you go from not working to working with feedback. I mean, my intuition is those should be the same, so maybe it's understanding this.
Why should they be this? I mean, they don't need to be the same simply because we're not there. It's not a variation in the same variable, right? Not the same variable is true. We're talking first in the first panel, the first one, a variation in the attitude, holding another variable constant. And in the other one, we're talking about a variation in another. They do not need to be to be identical. Yeah. So it's the change that doesn't necessarily need to be. Okay.
My name is Tilman Brook from Berlin. I like the effort very much. Thanks a lot. I go through a lot of technical bits, but I want to encourage you to focus more on sort of the interpretation, my reading of these intergenerational transmission literatures. That you have things on, say, education. So, you know, parental education, children's education. You have things on well-being, parental well-being, children's well-being. You have health. So it's sort of always the same thing. And what I like about your paper is that it sort of crosses from, you know, you question whether it goes from attitudes to behavior, you know, or vice versa. And so this sort of crossover theme. And I think if you could put your results back into the literature, comparing that to some of these other streams, you know, that data richness that you seem to have, I think perhaps is the most interesting thing.
Any question?
I just like your remarks at the end about observational learning, which was sort of new to me. I don't know that so psychology literature, but it sounded promising. If you just enlarge on that for 2 minutes, I'd appreciate it, and maybe a benefit enlarging on the paper. If your quick summary was indeed an accurate presentation of what there is.
Yeah, from what I know about the literature, is that as a strong social psychology, we show that well, I think there are two types of learning. So you can have observational learning from observing your parents, or you can have some kind of verbal persuasion from your parents. And these two can go from positive or negative. But there is a strong social psychology which says that verbal execution of your parents only work if your behavior is compatible. So if you don't have dissonant views from there seems to be a lot of results that show that. So behavior is mediated by verbal learning, but not the other way around. So this is kind of what we find. So just by listening to your parents, you don't inform your opinions if their behavior is compatible.
Do you want to add any comments?
No, I'll take many of your comments and I hope we'll talk afterwards. And
Thank you very much.
there's so many of them that I don't know where to stop.
Thank you very much. So this is joint work with myself, Afshan, and Adam Marsh at Oxford University. I'm going to talk about cloaking and ear effects. And this is from an experiment that we conducted mostly in 2009. Let me give you just a bit of information. So there is this idea that hotel education campaigns are widely seen as a way to improve the conduct of elections and increase participation and political accountability. There has been a number of them in recent years, and specifically this paper is going to focus on social network effects, even though I'm going to talk a little bit about the average effects. So, voter education in Mozambique. Mozambique has seen a pronounced decrease in electoral turnout, accompanied by the consolidation of the power of the incumbent. So that's very clear. If you look at the election from '94, voter education. So basically, the voter education campaign that we studied provided information about the election while underlining the importance of participation. So in fact, we had three types of interventions, so three treatments to be specific. The focus of this paper is not really about the different treatments, because in fact lots of the results are shared across the different treatments. But anyway, for completeness, I should mention that we have two treatments. So one basically focusing, so it was civic education, focused on election, and we used SMS, so text, to send information to people about election. Then we had a hotline for reporting electoral problems, and this was pretty much the inverse, so basically people sending information to us and us spreading the information to people. And then we had also a free newspaper being distributed, which really focused a lot on voter education during the election period. So these are the electoral trends in Mozambique. So starting with the first elections in '94 after the Civil War, you can clearly find a huge decrease in turnout, in voter turnout, from close to 90% to in 2004 to 76%, and then a little bit higher for 2008. I'm not going to claim that this increase is due to the extent. So the research questions. So first of all, what are the effects of voter education interventions on voter turnout, on information and interest about elections? So that's very clearly our focus. But we focus in this paper on social network effects, so indirect effects. Specifically, we separated in reinforcement effects on the respondents directly targeted by the campaigners, and between reinforcement and diffusion effects. And diffusion effects, it's really about untargeted respondents within the same location as the target. So we use three measures of social networks: geographic, so the distance between households, whether people report chatting frequently, and whether people have a family connection, so kinship. So in terms of very quick review of the results, because probably I won't have time for all of them. So in terms of average effect, so what we find that this is really from a paper with Paul and Jenny Ecker. So turnout increases for all voter education treatment. Evidence basically of both direct and indirect average effect. And also we find that information increases as well about the elections and for some of the treatments. But this paper is really about the second part of the slide, so it's really about network effects. So what we find here is that reinforcement and diffusion effects are similar across all outcomes. So reinforcement, so even the size of reinforcement and diffusion seems to be very similar. And we also see that these different network measures, I won't say channel, but measures also behave similar, with some relative prominence for each. Now, the most interesting result that we find here, and it's still we're still trying to understand it fully, it's really about networks, and it's really about what we find is that costly behavior, so turnout and also an incentive-compatible behavioral measure of voting participation that we had actually yield negative network effects. On the other side, with respect to information and interest, we find positive network effects. So this is probably our main couple of results. So this is my plan, but I'm not sure how. Let me just give you a very quick idea of what's the intuition that we have for the main result. So just picking up from the literature, and the literature on political participation is huge, but there is this idea that people, so if I think of access as participation, so people want to maximize their utility may depend on the outcome of the election, and also intrinsically on their own action. So there is this huge debate of whether people vote because they intrinsically think they should do so, or because they affect the outcome. And it's very unlikely that people affect the outcome. Even so, there is still a debate about that. Still, there is certainly a cost of voting, and it's there. So voter education campaigning is very general setting, may change information, which may change basically the way I see the impact of my action on the electoral outcome. And also, it may change civic mind. So basically, we hope that I think we can understand the impact of this campaign in these two ways. So both channels need participation, namely voter turnout. And that's the basic idea that we Now, think at the extreme, and I'm not going to hold that in Mozambique there is no political competition, but think at the extreme, since the election was in fact 75% for the incumbent, think at the extreme that there is no competition. So it's really fairly, or it's really the incumbent. It's basically contest across ballot stations on voting for the incumbent. So who gets more votes, who votes more for the incumbent will get more public goods in the future. So in that very simple way, way, then turnout increases, but the incumbent score also increases. In fact, that's what we found. But if the election becomes less competitive because of this, because the campaign increased turnout and basically turnout for the incumbent, if the election becomes less competitive, these may have actually a negative effect. So free riding may happen, leading to lower turnout. So basically, it is possible that as a second order network effect on participation will have a negative effect. Okay? So as the race is perceived to be less close. Effects on information and interest do not entail a clear cost, so there is no reason to expect that network effects are negative. Because basically there is no clear cost. So I'll skip this part about background, it's not so important. So the experimental design. There are also details here, so I'll be a bit quick because the details are not so important in terms of different treatments. I'll give you an overview. So there was 3 treatments provided nationwide in 4 provinces of Mozambique in coordination, basically with a newspaper, which was a recent newspaper at the time, and a consortium of NGOs interested in election observation. In terms of measurement, we have a before-after panel survey. Then we also look at the SMS system that we had in place for measurement, and I'll be specific about that in a moment. And of course, we look at election results, but these are not very helpful for network effects because they are actually at the level of the ballot station. Now, in terms of treatments, number 1, civic education. So there was a leaflet distributed, steps for voting. This was in fact an electoral commission leaflet. But then the bulk of the treatment was, so that was to start with, but then the bulk of the treatment was about SMS. And 14 days before the election, 5 SMS were sent to each respondent in these locations every day. So it's a bit of a strong treatment. So 10 different messages giving information about voting, about the election data for the elections, candidates and parties, secrecy of the vote, etc. This was the leaflet, and basically with the steps, and it all ends up with an newspaper, which, by the way, is very important for me. Then, in terms of treatment number 2, what we had was a hotline. So it started with a leaflet explaining the hotline. And then, again, 14 days before the election, 4 SMS a day, reminding people that there was a hotline. And after verification with the correspondent per hotline location, basically the reports were disseminated to the hotline group of respondents. Okay, so basically there is a Ushahidi interface, which is evaluated. This was the leaflet that gave information about the hotline, so and the type of text that they should send with the location and the Then we had the newspaper, and we distributed the newspaper weekly from the pre-election visits until the post-election visits. So the newspaper is a one-year-old newspaper, it was at the time. Free newspaper with distribution in the area of Maputo City only, and we didn't work in Maputo City, so only outside, so only new locations for the newspaper. And it was already at that time the certified high circulation of the country, even being only for Maputo City. No clear political meaning, and there was non-purpose focus on voter education during this was the newspaper in the week of the election. And this was, by the way, the leaflet in the newspaper, and there was also a hotline, which is a different hotline, it's not a treatment, it was a national hotline that the newspaper had, rendered differently with different numbers. So in terms of measurement, so there were 161 enumeration areas chosen within the voting grid of Mozambique in 4 provinces, so it was really like, it was pretty much nationwide, Maputo province, Gaza, Silesia, and Cabo Delgado, and this was the disaggregation in terms of different treatments. So there was a pre-election survey, and a subgroup of subjects at the pre-election survey was chosen to be untargeted. So basically it was chosen before the treatment, it was chosen not to be targeted by the treatment, by the leaflets and newspaper. In terms of sampling, I should mention that it's pretty important that we actually are only serving in locations that were covered by mobile phones. So that's important. So this is not Mozambique. And at the local level, we require that people have access to cell phones. So everyone in the this is basically Maputo province, Gaza, Zambezia, and Candela. So that's the sense in which we were spread over the country. I must say that this gentleman wasn't so, he knows better than I. So, in terms of specifications, well, this is pretty standard. So these are for the average effect, and this is for the heterogeneous effects, for the network effects. Okay, so we are mainly interested in these effects. Now, in terms of measurement, we tried to be as careful as possible with measuring turnout. In fact, only recently, a couple of months ago, we had access to turnout at the level of the ballot stations, because results were not available until recently. And so we made a special effort because we worried about, from Afrobarometer, about the self-reports of turnout. So we asked lots of questions about the day of the election and about details of the ballots to check whether people were actually voting. Then we also had a behavioral measure, which was basically asking people to send an SMS. This was after the treatment. Getting people to send an SMS saying whether what the president should do what should be the policy priority. And we use these as basically a measure of political participation. So this is the other measure that I mentioned before. So this was how we disseminated this open web. So in terms of network measures, so basically sharding was based on a question, kinship also, distance it was based on maps, and geographical distance between the different households. And typically a sketch of the map would be like this. Now in terms of results, so in terms of balance, we don't have lots of problems here, so I'll skip this quickly. So there are lots of variables here, so I don't expect you to be able to read the table really, but rest assured that there are not so many significant results across the different groups. The same for the network variables, they seem balanced across the different comparison groups, control and treatment. And this is for the ballot station data. So at the level of ballot station for 2004, we don't see also much of a difference. Okay. So we employ different versions of survey-based turnout to check or to see whether there was an effect on turnout. And that's it. So basically, we use the self-reported, we use the self-reported adjusted by some basic ballot facts like the number of ballots, the number of boxes that they had in the ballot stations. We have the finger measure that is basically whether people have the finger after the election. And we have, these are two indices based on that bunch of questions about the electoral day. And this is the interviewer's assessment after all questions of whether the person had voted. And we also have there the open method. So we can see that there are clear direct effects. So these are the targeted, the effects on the targeted, clear direct effects between 5 and 12 percentage points of civic education and hotline on our measure of turnout. Some effects also for the open letter, but they don't survive these controls that we have. This is the indirect effect, so still average, and also we find clear effects here. In fact, somewhat larger than effects on the targeted for the newspaper, which is an interesting result that I cannot explain fully. And this is the results on information, so we have some clear effects on information of the hotline and of the newspaper, and both targeted and not targeted, so both direct and indirect. Now, and these are the average effects at the ballot station level. So at the ballot station level, we find clear positive effect of the newspaper on turnout, of civic education on turnout, both for the presidential and parliamentary elections. So this is not self-reported or based on survey, so it's at the level of the location. And we also find a negative effect of civic education on voting for which is in line with this idea that we actually favor with this treatment. Well, at least with this treatment, we actually favor the income. At least we harness the main challenge. Now, in terms of network effects. What we find, this is specifically the measure based on ink finger. So what we find is an interaction that is actually negative between network, and these are the different measures of networks and the treatment. And that is specifically the case here for this measure for proximity, for the proximity measure of networks. This is another measure of proximity. That's number one. We also find negative effects. And if I can show you the whole picture only for the interaction effects, you can find some significance and only for and only in negative. Okay, so all these interactions are okay. So then for the open letter, we find even not being so clear, we also find some negative effects. And this is for election information. Here we don't find so much, but we find it positive, and this is for interest. And here we clearly find positive effects for interest about the election. So here, so overall, we clearly find negative network interaction, so basically network interaction for turnout, but we find positive network interactions for other measures like interest about the election or information about the election. So, concluding, so various types of voter education, employing cell phones and free newspapers, are effective at increasing voter turnout and participation. They also led to increased information about the election. However, social network effects seem to be more complicated. So voting behavior is negatively affected, namely voter turnout. And this is consistent, that's all I can say, consistent with the idea of free riding. Once they know the target, they are changing their behavior. So that's a possible interpretation. So information and interest about the elections are still positively affected, so they are not negatively affected, and that's it. So in fact, there is an interesting, this is really ongoing work by Anne Vash, and she found that actually, because we had an interview inside the household, she actually finds positive effects inside the household on turnout. So very different from this social communication. Thank you very much.
I really enjoyed reading the paper. So just to summarize, they present a randomized experiment that examines whether treatment effects of voter education campaigns transmit through social networks. They had 3 interventions, which were free newspapers that provided neutral information about the election, leaflets that provided civic education, and text messaging, which was a hotline where citizens could report electoral problems. The randomized experiment was carried out at the polling location level. So they selected 161 polling locations, which were mediated by the fact that they had to have a cell phone mast close by. And 40 were assigned to each treatment, and 51 were under control. And treatments were also randomized across respondents and households within each enumeration area, which allows for this analysis of what the network effects are. So of 11 households that were interviewed at the first time in each enumeration area, 9 were randomly assigned to treatment, and 2 were on average randomly assigned to the control. So what they find is that all the treatments increased voter turnout for both targeted and untargeted individuals, but they find negative peer effects, especially for the hotline. And they interpret these findings within the framework of costly political participation and that people are free riding. So the mechanism that's given for the negative social network effects is free riding. But I guess, so I felt that there was a little bit of a missing step, because so we find that the network effects produce more information about the election and also more interest. But then for that to translate into less participation, it has to be that, well, so people now know more about the election and they're more interested, but then they feel that their individual vote is useless or is less valuable, I suppose. So if you could if you have information about maybe how important each person believes their vote is. And it sounds like in Mozambique, since the incumbent party has had such a majority over many years, these people rightly believe that their vote won't really change the results. So learning more about the system makes them right at digital issue. Something else I was wondering is who are being induced into voting by your treatment. So there's another paper that I did looking at network effects, and I found that different people in the network induced into a certain behavior by the treatment have different effects on people's behavior. So it could be that the people who are being pushed into voting by your treatments are people who the individuals don't want to, emulate, perhaps. So maybe that could be another reason. I was also curious about the hotline. So there was an instance where you said that not everybody had cell phones, so they were sharing. And if the hotline, sent somebody 14 times 5, that's 70 SMSs. So if I was sharing it with friends, so I got 70 times 5, then for sure I'd be less likely to vote because I got 350 SMSs in 2 weeks. But then I don't know how many girls would answer. And then whether there are any other elections that are more tightly contested. So it sounds like the presidential election was nothing that they could really do, or an individual's vote wouldn't really change the outcome terribly, but whether there are any other more tightly contested elections, maybe at the municipal level, and see whether that changed things at all. And I think it would also be interesting to see later on, maybe in the next elections, if even maybe the field of candidates who come up from the areas that are treated is more than the number of candidates that come in areas where those are treated.
So now,
Just a technical question. Was SMS free to receive for recipients?
to receive, yes. I think as she was suggesting that municipal elections in one from the other, which was more political than presidential election, interesting to see the effect on the participation because that sounds like if you learn the distribution of voters by talking with your peers or more or less when I'm saying people to vote with the So I'm collecting them, but I'll try to answer.
I just have a question regarding the ballot results, where you show also significant, as I understood, significant increase in general of all the treatment, but in particular the newspaper treatment. As far as I understood. So I have two questions. So first one is, it seemed that from the survey results there were no significant effects from the newspaper treatment. So why this difference? Is it just a power issue, or what is it? I don't know if I understand correctly the data. And the second, if you have negative peer effects, then should we interpret the positive ballot effects as if the negative peer effects don't outnumber the positive direct effects? Or how is that?
Can you say it again?
So you have positive direct effects and negative peer effects. But if you have positive ballot, like overall ballot effects, should we then interpret it as if the direct effects are just much larger than the negative peer effects? How is that?
Okay. So maybe, okay. I think only I'll pick up a question.
So in your model, there's two reasons people vote. One is they might have direct utility from voting. The other is they might believe they're pivotal in some way, or that they're going to affect the result. So since it's very unlikely that they think they're pivotal, we assume they must have a direct utility reason to vote. So if that's the reason to vote, why would there be a free riding effect where by learning more about the elections, they're less likely to want to vote?
Okay. So thank you very much for your questions. So I'll have a minute to answer some of them. So municipal elections. So thank you very much for your initial comments, which have my suggestions with respect to municipal elections. So these elections specifically didn't have a local component, so it was all nation. So we could not work with candidates at the local level. So we don't have that much energy. With respect to the newspaper, so the newspaper, what we have is basically, so we don't seem to have. Let me be sure. We don't have a direct effect of the newspaper, but we have an indirect effect, which is in fact quite strong. So an effect is quite larger than the direct effect, which is kind of pleasant. We don't have a great story for this. So then I'm talking about positive effects that are not synergies. So there are positive effects that are not, well, maybe they are through networks, but they are through networks that are not our members of networks. So we don't know. It may be. So at least that can explain results at the level of also. In terms of the two reasons, so that's a good point. So basically, we wanted to encompass the possibility of all the possible reasons that people want to vote. The story with intrinsic motivation is much more complicated. So I agree with you that it's important that we believe that people believe that they are able to affect the outcome. Thank you very much. So let's reconvene in 10 minutes.
Then break to pay. The first paper will be by Abdul. We have 20 minutes to present, 5 for discussion and 5 for Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chairman.